Hi, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I am the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project, and I'm really excited to be speaking to the Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ today for your Super Saturday meeting. I know many of you, I know some of you know me from volunteering or working with my nonprofit, the Environmental Voter Project, and it's a tremendous honor to be a part of this work that you do every now and then on a Saturday. So we're going to spend the next 20-25 minutes together, and I'm going to be talking about the importance of environmental voting. So before we jump into that, I'm going to share my screen here. Here we go. Now, you'll see this is titled How Your Voice is Heard and Why Your Vote Counts. And obviously, 2022 is a midterm election year, but I think many of you, and certainly many of your friends, might not realize the enormous power that you, particularly as environmentalists, might have just by voting. So don't worry, this is going to be a completely nonpartisan discussion that we're about to have. But because all of you care so deeply about creation care, and because all of you care so deeply about finding accessible ways to make a difference, the organizers of this Super Saturday thought that it would be important for us to have this brief discussion. And the way this is going to be organized is as follows. First, we're going to go into just very, very little detail about why the Environmental Voter Project, my nonprofit, likes to work with UCC, and hopefully vice versa. Then we're going to go into what I just mentioned, the importance of environmental voting. Then we'll briefly touch on the specific work of my nonprofit. And then we'll close with what you can do to make an impact. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Why UCC and EVP work together? One, we're a completely nonpartisan nonprofit, yet we are at the intersection of two things that I know UCC congregations view as extraordinarily important. One is creation care, and two is finding a way to become civically engaged, finding these easy and accessible opportunities to make a difference and bring your values to society. We've loved working with each other. I'm going to mention a few ways that we have worked with each other in the past and continue to work with each other, but that's why I'm talking to you today. So let's get into the second part. Let's get into the gist of why we're here. One of the big reasons, if not the biggest reason, right now, why we can't consistently enact progressive environmental policies, whether we're talking at the federal level, the state level, or the local level. It's because of what you see right here on this slide. When you poll environmental voters for any election, we could be talking about a presidential race, we could be talking about a city council race, we could be talking about Idaho or Maine or Georgia or Massachusetts. But when you poll voters in that election and ask them the issues they care most about, climate change and other environmental issues are way, way, way down the bottom of that list of priorities. If you take this poll as an example, this is a poll of people who actually voted in the 2020 presidential election, and this was taken right after that election. Everybody was given an option to name 3 of their top most important issues. Only 14% listed climate change or the environment in their top 3. Now that number's gone up recently, which is nice. Didn't used to be 14, but boy, is that not enough to drive policymaking. And believe me, when we narrow it down to asking voters to name their number 1 most important issue, I mean, we're lucky if climate gets 3, 4, 5%. And what I want to suggest to you is this is an enormous problem for the environmental movement right now. And here's why. Because campaigns only care about These people that you just saw in that poll, voters. Campaigns and politicians and policymakers, on the other hand, do not care about non-voters. And we're going to go into the weeds a little bit here, but please bear with me because this point that I'm about to make is crucially important. I would even suggest that it is the single building block upon which all political campaigns are run and all policy is made. And that is this. Who you vote for is secret. I hope that doesn't surprise anybody. But whether you vote or not, whether you show up and cast a ballot in any particular election, that is public record. And not only is it public record, it is a public record that anybody running any campaign has access to. And so let me bring you inside the room, sitting around the conference table at the first meeting that any campaign ever has. Let's say I'm running a campaign for mayor, which I happen to have done many times before, or a campaign for governor or Congress or Senate. You sit around the table, you open up your laptop, you go onto public voter files. And if you're running for governor, the first thing you do is you say, oh, I'm running a campaign for governor in Virginia. Who actually votes in gubernatorial campaigns in Virginia? Well, you've got some people over here, they're not registered to vote. Well, probably not going to talk to them. Oh, these people are registered to vote, but they never show up. Probably not going to talk to them either. These people are registered to vote, but it looks like they only vote in presidential elections. Oh, whereas these people over here, they do vote in gubernatorial elections. Oh, and these ones even vote in local elections. Let's talk to them too. They're really good voters. This is so important to understand. Campaigns have limited time and limited money, and their only goal is one thing, and that's getting 50% plus one of the vote on a Tuesday in November, period. And when that's your goal, and when you have limited time and limited money, and you literally know by name and street address who votes in the election you're trying to win and who doesn't, well, who do you think they're going to target? They are only going to target the people who are likely to show up. Yeah, sometimes if they're loaded with cash or have all the time in the world, they will start talking to lower propensity voters, but those people get their last dollar, not their first 99. And so because campaigns and policymakers and politicians know who is likely to vote in the elections they're trying to win, who do you think those campaigns poll? Well, they don't poll the non-voters. No, they poll the people who are likely to show up. Those are the people whose opinions matter. Simply put, and I know this sounds cynical, politicians don't care about the priorities of non-voters. And I know this sounds creepy, but they know by name and street address who the non-voters are. And they also know by name and street address who the voters are. And so those voters, they are the ones whose opinions matter. They are the ones whose political priorities drive policymaking because they're going to make up the denominator on election day. When people talk on CNN about candidate A getting 51% of the vote and candidate B getting 49%, well, the denominator matters. And it's only the denominator of the people who show up. And not to repeat myself, but it's extraordinarily important. It is public record who has a history of voting in these elections. Now, why have I taken you down this slight tangent talking about public voter records and how campaigns are run? Well, because it really directly speaks to the importance of environmentalist voting. Because this, what I just told you, is not very good news for the environment. Because pretty much every poll of pretty much every election looks something like this. And so any politician running for any office anywhere has to deal with this lack of demand among voters for environmental leadership. And I would suggest to you that that more than anything else, is why it is so hard to get politicians to lead on climate and the environment. It's not because all of them reject climate science. No, in fact, most of them accept it. Some of them won't admit it because it's not to their political benefit to admit it. But oh my gosh, I could spend hours listing for you all of the people who in 2010 accepted climate science, but then by 2015 changed their minds and all of a sudden were doubting it because it was to their political benefit. No, it all has to do with politics. And right now, the people who actually vote, they don't prioritize climate and the environment enough. This gets to the heart of why we at the Environmental Voter Project started our work. And I'm going to describe to you what that is very shortly. Don't worry, we'll get there. But what I came to realize, what led me to the founding of the Environmental Voter Project, is I started seeing data like this in every campaign that I was running, and I was enormously frustrated because we saw, oh my gosh, with so few voters caring deeply about climate and the environment, it would be malpractice to spend our precious time and money talking about this issue that doesn't resonate with voters. But it turned out, the more I dug into the data, that the reason so few voters cared deeply about climate and the environment wasn't because too few Americans did. I'll say that again because it's important. The reason so few voters care deeply about climate and the environment is not because too few Americans did. Actually, it turns out there are tens of millions of Americans who care so deeply about climate change, care so deeply about environmental justice and clean air and clean water, that these environmental issues are their #1 priority. So why aren't they showing up in polls of voters like this? Well, for one very good reason. Environmentalists aren't voting. It turns out that the modern environmental movement in America doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem or a behavioral problem. There are tens of millions of Americans who don't need to be convinced. They don't need their minds changed or their opinions changed. They're already dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists. They are there with us. They're just not showing up on election day to take this very important high leverage action. And that gets to what we do with the Environmental Voter Project. Because we have found that there are huge numbers of these environmentalists who don't vote. You'll see in the 2020 presidential election, 8.1 million already registered to vote environmentalists. Already registered to vote environmentalists just stayed home on election day. And you'll see the numbers are even higher for midterm elections. 12.4 million already registered environmentalists didn't vote in 2018 for those midterms, and we predict over 13 million are currently unlikely to vote this year based on their previous voting histories. So what do we do with the Environmental Voter Project? And ultimately, how does this intersect with UCC's goals of creation care and civic engagement? Well, what we do with the Environmental Voter Project is pretty simple. We turn non-voting environmentalists into voters. And so, in a nutshell, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that just does two things. We use these voter files that I told you about to individually identify these super environmentalists who list climate or the environment as their #1 priority, yet they aren't voting. And then we deliver completely nonpartisan, apolitical messaging to them to turn them into better voters, so that we can try to address that lack of voter demand that I told you about earlier. Because remember, politicians don't care how many non-voting environmentalists there are out there. Those aren't the people who are showing up on election day. By definition, they're non-voters. But you better believe that politicians care about how many environmental voters there are. Because even in this hyper-polarized, super partisan environment that we live in today, there is still one thing that unites all Democrats and Republicans. And that is, boy, do they both like winning elections. I don't care how liberal or conservative or moderate you are, you go where the voters are, because that's how you get to be a politician. It's the brutal arithmetic of how democracy works. Either you go where the votes are, or you don't get to be a politician anymore. And so what we try to do at the Environmental Voter Project is just make more environmental voters. And the way that we do it is what we like to think of as the easy way. We have chosen not to try to change minds and change opinions and try to rationally convince people to start caring more about climate and the environment. Oh my gosh, is that hard? No, we're in the behavior change business. What we do is we find these non-voting environmentalists, these people who don't need their minds changed, don't need their opinions changed. They just need a behavioral intervention. And what we do is we canvass, we call, we text, we mail, we send digital ads to them. And we also partner with wonderful organizations like yours to try to tweak their behavior, to try to turn them into better voters. And I won't claim that behavior change is easy. It's not. But boy, is it easier than changing people's minds. Boy, is it easier than trying to turn a climate denier into someone who recognizes its reality and its importance. So very, very quickly, how do we do this at the Environmental Voter Project? And please forgive me that I'm going to breeze over this. This is not meant to be a presentation about our nonprofit. It's meant to be a presentation about how our nonprofit works with UCC congregations to address these particularly important issues. But I will just very, very briefly give you an overview. The way that we do this is a three-step process. One, we use data analytics and these voter files that I told you about to individually identify people who have a really high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their top priority. Yet we know from their public voting histories that they are unlikely to vote in a particular election. Now, I know I just said a whole lot, and believe me, I could give an entire seminar on how we identify these people, but this is not the right moment for that. But what this identification process enables us to do is individually identify who these super environmentalists are. And then we can bypass the hardest, most expensive part of politics, which is education and changing minds and changing opinions, and go right to behavior change. And that's what we do with this second part, mobilization. Once we find these super environmentalists, we can be completely agnostic and apolitical with our messaging. I mean, we could talk about chocolate chip cookies at this point if it was the best way to get these folks to vote. And so what we do is we test hundreds of different messages each year. We text, we call, we canvass, we send postcards and direct mail and digital advertisements. We submit our work to dozens of randomized control trials, all optimizing the right messaging to the right subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists, just to get them to do one thing, and that is become better voters. And then third and finally, we focus on habit reinforcement. What we are focused on at EVP is not winning one-off elections. Believe me, talking to infrequent voters is not a very efficient way to win one election. Instead, we're focused on redressing those problems I told you about at the beginning, that lack of voter demand in the electorate for environmental leadership. And the way we do that is by, over time, over multiple elections, dramatically increasing the number of voters who demand that environmental leadership. Not non-voters, they don't matter, but voters. And the way we do that is by treating every election as a crucially important behavioral intervention opportunity. No election is too small. No election is objectively unimportant enough for us to ignore it. Because even if it's a library trustee race that has nothing to do with the environment, well, the only way to turn a non-voter into a voter is to have them vote. And so We never want to skip one of those elections. We never want to forego an opportunity to communicate with these non-voters and try to change their habits over time, because voting can be a habitual behavior, just like exercising or eating healthy can be. We currently work in these 17 states. We are active now. We have already been active in almost 100 elections already in 2022, because we love using these little local elections as ways to improve these non-voting environmentalist voting habits. I know I quickly breezed over why the Environmental Voter Project does what it does and how we do it. This is not the moment for us to go into lots of detail about that. But if you are more interested in that, please go to environmentalvoter.org/about. Very, very quickly, we get great results on this stuff. We launched at the end of 2015, and then at the end of 2016, after our proof of concept was done, we sort of stood up for good. And so since those 5 years, we don't have our end of 2021 data yet. Since those 5 years, in these 12 states that you see there, we've communicated with 7.4 million individual low propensity environmental voters. And as you'll see here, we can see in voter files already that 730,000 of them have become such consistent voters that they have voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and their most recent local election. This is how powerful this approach can be. This is how powerful it can be to find the people who don't need their minds changed, they just need their behavior changed. Just last year in 2021, we're still waiting for the second half of last year's voter files to be updated. But you can see we were active in almost 400 elections. This is an odd year where most people were taking time off, but not us, because this year-round engagement is so important for changing habits. And as you can see, our one-off impact on elections was really significant. These results that you see in the third column there, those are results shown by randomized control trials. What that means is we were solely responsible, while controlling for all outside variables, for boosting turnout almost 1 percentage point in those Georgia US Senate runoff elections among our targets. We got up to close to 2 percentage points in New York City's mayoral primary and San Antonio's mayoral election. These might not sound like big numbers, but ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.8 percentage points is. That's everything in this game, everything. If you want to know more about our results and our impact, please go to environmentalvoter.org/results. As we look ahead to 2022, I just want to remind you of this slide. These low propensity, these unlikely to vote environmentalists are an enormous pool of potential political power. You might shake your head and say, oh my gosh, all the people who I know who care about the environment, they vote like it's their job. Well, I'm telling you, it probably ain't true. And I know that might sound frustrating. I know you might think, oh my gosh, why aren't these people voting? But it is also an enormous opportunity. It is an enormous opportunity because, as I've said a few times now, changing minds is hard, especially in this crazy post-truth weird world that we live in. But changing behavior is easier. And I'm going to give you some easy techniques to do it. And this is why we love working with UCC. And this is a huge opportunity for the environmental movement. In those 17 states where EVP works in, I just want to very briefly show you the size of this opportunity. We've identified 665,000 of these unlikely to vote super environmentalists in Florida. That's so big that number equals 8.1% of all ballots that were cast last time there was a midterm in Florida. In Arizona, there's so many unlikely to vote environmentalists that they're 10.6% of all ballots that were cast. And then look at some of these other swingy states. New Hampshire, almost 20%. Pennsylvania, over 14%. This is an enormous opportunity. an enormous opportunity. So how can we take advantage of it together? Well, first of all, if you want to volunteer with our nonprofit, boy, would we love to have you. As you can see on the bottom there, you can go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved and volunteer to call these non-voting environmentalists. You can send postcards to them. You can knock on their doors in any of our 17 states. A lot of the states are in New England, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Maine, very close to New York. You can also pledge to vote and get other people to pledge to vote. Working with UCC, we have created what's called a Creation Care Pledge. And you can see the URL at the bottom there. It's that weird looking bit.ly URL, bit.ly/vote-your-values. If you go there, we just ask people to promise to vote in every election and always prioritize creation care. That might sound like a very small, simple thing, and it is. But take it from someone who lives the behavioral science of voting. It is a crucially important tool. Because what we know from behavioral science is that one of the strongest norms in modern, certainly American, but actually global society, is that most people want to be thought of as honest, trustworthy people. No one wants to be thought of as a liar. And so if you get someone to sign a promise to vote, what we'll do at the Environmental Voter Project, free of charge, is whenever they have an election, we will send them an email, not only reminding them, letting them know about the election, but reminding them that they made a promise to vote. Don't worry, we won't really turn the screws and put lots of pressure on them. But even those subtle reminders, not just that there is an election coming up, but that you made a promise that you were going to vote in every election, is such a high leverage behavioral science nudge. Because the truth is, most people understand that the value of their one vote in an election is rarely going to make a difference. But as I said before, most people also want to be thought of as honest people who keep their promises. And so what we want to do with members of UCC congregations around Southern New England, around all of New England, around all of the country, is get as many people to sign these creation care pledges as possible. And then finally, be a loud and proud environmental voter. Again, take it from someone who lives the behavioral science of voting. You have an enormous amount of societal magnetism, of societal power. Whether you think so or not, people look to you for cues as to what's appropriate behavior. And so your peers, your friends, your family, your fellow congregants, all of you are looking around at each other to figure out, what does it mean to be a good environmentalist? What does it mean to be a good member of my faith community? And it's so important for you to equate being a voter with those other norms. You are an environmentalist, hence you are also a good voter. You are a good member of your faith community, and so you are also a good voter. You need to equate it in those somewhat uncomfortable normative ways. But you have so much power when you do that. Because if your friends and family members and peers and congregants see you incorporate voting as part of who you are in that community, oh man, does it change their behavior too. So please, please do that as well. All right, we said this was going to be a 30-minute presentation. We are getting really close to the 30-minute mark. So I will close up. If you want to volunteer with our organization, we would love to have you. environmentalvoter.org/get-involved. Please go sign up for these creation care pledges. We love working with UCC congregations. We really want to remind you of the elections that you've got, but even more importantly, we want to take advantage of these behavioral science cues to get people who care deeply about the environment to start voting. Because I said at the very beginning, politicians want to win elections. And so what they do is they look at voter files to figure out who votes. And those are the people who are first-class citizens. Those are the people who get polled. Those are the people whose priorities move policymaking. Because the dirty little secret about politics is, yeah, it's important who wins and loses elections. Of course it is. But even when you elect the so-called right people, they can't just snap their fingers and get whatever they want. That's something we're seeing right now in real time. Any politician has limited amounts of political capital to get what they want done. And nobody is going to spend their political capital on something that voters don't care about. They're just not. And so it's incumbent upon us to do the easy things, like voting, but also finding good, impactful ways to encourage other people to vote. So thank you for inviting me to speak to all of you. Thank you for everything that you do, both as a part of SNEUCC, but as part of these Super Saturdays, and as part of your congregations. I really hope that you'll take time to sign this pledge. I really hope that you'll take time to visit us at environmentalvoter.org. And thank you so much.